There was a boy in Rimini who used to stand at the edge of the town square when the traveling circuses came through, watching the tent go up in the half-light before dawn, and he would stay there until his mother came looking for him, pulling him back toward school or supper or whatever ordinary thing he was supposed to be doing instead. He watched the way the canvas lifted and filled with air, the way the ropes pulled taut, the way the whole structure became something else as the sun came up, not just a tent anymore, but a promise of transformation. He watched the performers arrive in the afternoon, tired and eating bread from paper, looking nothing like what they would become that night under the lights. He understood, even then, that the circus was not a place, but a kind of lying that everyone agreed to believe, and he wanted to be part of it. This was Federico Fellini in the early 1930s, in a town on the Adriatic coast that smelled of salt and fish and the particular dust that rises from limestone streets in summer. Rimini was small enough that everyone knew everyone, large enough to have a movie theater and a train station and the sense that somewhere else, Rome, Milan, the world beyond the sea, life was happening in ways that it was not happening here. It was a resort town, which meant that for a few months every summer it filled with people from somewhere else, people with money and boredom and the temporary freedom that comes from being away from home. And then they left, and the town contracted again into its off-season self, quieter and more inward, and the boy who would become Fellini learned to live in both versions of the place, the loud and the quiet, the full and the empty. He was born on January 20th, 1920, the second child of Ida Barbiani and Arbano Fellini. His father sold coffee and other goods, traveling between towns often away. His mother was from Rome, which mattered, which gave her a kind of urban sophistication that set her apart in Rimini, or at least, that was how Federico remembered it later. She told stories about the city, about the grandness of it, the churches and the streets and the life that moved through them. She made Rome sound like a dream of civilization, and the boy listened and accumulated a longing for a place he had never seen. The family was not wealthy, but not poor either. There was food, there were clothes, there was school. There was also the church, which in Italy in those years was not optional, not a matter of personal conviction, but the structure through which life was organized. Baptisms and saints' days in the rhythms of confession and mass, and the unspoken understanding that the church knew things about you that you did not yet know about yourself. Fellini grew up inside that vocabulary, the Madonna and the saints and the priests in their black cassocks, and he absorbed it the way children absorb the language spoken around them, not as doctrine, but as atmosphere, as the way the world was decorated. He drew constantly, caricatures mostly, faces made strange and exaggerated, noses too long, chins too weak, eyes bulging or sleepy or wild. He had a talent for it, a quick hand, and an eye that found the comic distortion inside the normal face. He filled notebooks with these drawings, showed them to friends, passed them around. He liked making people laugh. He liked the power of it, the way a few lines on paper could turn a face into a joke, could reveal something hidden or make something up entirely. He was not interested in drawing things as they were. He was interested in what they could become if you pushed them a little, bent them, made them more than they were. At school he was unremarkable, neither brilliant nor hopeless, drifting through with the minimum effort required. He liked language, he liked stories. He had no patience for mathematics or the sciences. He wrote little sketches, comic scenes, bits of dialogue. He listened to the radio, to the variety shows and the singers and the announcers with their smooth voices selling soap and pasta. He went to the movies whenever he could, which was often. The cinema in Rimini showed everything that came through. Italian films, American films, French films, whatever arrived. He sat in the dark and watched the light move on the screen, and felt the particular stillness that happens when a roomful of people forgets where they are. The films he saw were the films of the 1930s, which meant they were often loud and obvious and sentimental, designed to comfort or distract or sell the fantasy of a better life. But sometimes there was something else, a moment or a mood or a face that stayed with him after the lights came up. He did not think of himself as someone who would make films. He thought of himself as someone who would get out of Rimini, who would go to Rome, who would do something that involved stories or drawings or laughter, something that was not selling coffee or working in an office or staying in the same town his whole life. When he was 17, in 1937, he went to Rome for the first time. It was a school trip, a few days to see the monuments and the museums, the kind of trip that was supposed to be educational and ended up being mostly about being away from home, being in a group of boys in a city where no one knew them. But for Fellini it was something else. Rome was not just bigger than Rimini. It was differently alive, crowded and noisy and full of a kind of energy that felt both ancient and completely modern. The streets were narrow and tangled, the buildings were enormous and crumbling and covered in stone faces and Latin inscriptions he could not read. There were fountains everywhere, water pouring into basins, people filling jugs and washing their hands and sitting on the edges talking. There were churches with doors open to the street, dark interiors filled with candles and gold and the smell of incense. There were cafes with tables on the sidewalks, men in suits reading newspapers, women in dresses walking past with a kind of purpose he had never seen in Rimini. He walked around in a daze, trying to see everything at once, filling his head with images he would spend the rest of his life returning to. He saw the Colosseum, which was smaller than he expected but more ruined, more real. He saw the Victor Emmanuel Monument, which was enormous and white and ridiculous like a wedding cake for a giant. He saw the Trevi Fountain, which was not yet famous in the way it would become after he made it famous, but which already had the quality of a stage set, a place where you went not to see water but to perform the act of being in Rome. He understood immediately that Rome was not a city to live in, but a city to dream about, a city that had already been imagined so many times that the real version was just one more fantasy layered on top of all the others. And he wanted to be part of that fantasy. He wanted to live inside it. He went back to Rimini and finished school without distinction. In 1939, when he was 19, he moved to Rome. There was no plan exactly, no job waiting, no clear idea of what he would do. He told his parents he was going to enroll in law school, which was a respectable thing to say and which he had no intention of actually doing. He rented a room, he walked around, he looked for work. He sold caricatures on the street, quick portraits of tourists and soldiers, a few lire per drawing. He wrote jokes and sketches and tried to sell them to newspapers and radio programs. He submitted gags to a humor magazine called Marcirello, and they bought a few and then a few more, and eventually they offered him a job as a staff writer and cartoonist. Marcirello was not a prestigious publication, but it was a real one. A weekly magazine that published comic sketches and satire and cartoons, the kind of thing people read on the train or in a cafe and then left behind. Fellini worked there alongside other young writers and artists, people who were funny and quick and not particularly interested in being serious about anything. They wrote about daily life, about the absurdities of bureaucracy and romance, and the small humiliations of being young and broke in a big city. Fellini was good at it. He had the timing, the eye for the ridiculous, the ability to make something out of nothing. He drew and he wrote and he made friends. One of the people he met during this time was Aldo Fabrizi, a comedian and actor who performed in variety shows and on the radio. Fabrizi was loud and physical, a big man with a big presence, and he liked Fellini's sense of humor. They began working together, Fellini writing material for Fabrizi's act, little scenes and jokes that Fabrizi would perform on stage. This was Fellini's introduction to performance, to the idea that what you wrote could be turned into something physical, something that happened in front of people, something that changed depending on how it was said, how the audience reacted. He loved it. He loved the immediacy of it, the feeling that the thing you made was alive. Through Fabrizi he met other people in the Roman entertainment world, actors and writers and directors who were working in theater and radio and increasingly in film. The Italian film industry in the early 1940s was small and strange, caught between Mussolini's propaganda apparatus, which wanted movies to glorify the regime, and the filmmakers themselves, who mostly wanted to make comedies and melodramas that people would actually watch. The war was happening, first far away and then closer, and Rome was full of contradictions. Soldiers on leave, refugees, black market deals, a sense that the official version of reality and the actual version were moving further and further apart. Fellini kept writing and drawing. In 1943, he met a young actress named Giulietta Messina. She was small and delicate, with enormous eyes and a face that could go from comic to heartbreaking in a moment. She was performing on the radio, doing voices and comic sketches, and Fellini heard her and wanted to meet her. They were introduced, they started talking, they fell in love quickly and married within a few months, on October 30th, 1943. It was wartime, which meant the wedding was small and hurried and overshadowed by the fact that the Germans had occupied Rome and the city was no longer safe in the way it had been, even in the uneasy way it had been before. But they were young and they were together, and Giulietta believed in Federico in a way that no one else had, believed that he was going to do something, even if neither of them knew what. The war ended, and Rome began to rebuild, and the film industry began to change. There was a new movement, or maybe not a movement exactly, but a new impulse, a feeling among certain filmmakers that the old way of making movies, in studios with scripts about aristocrats and melodramas set in palaces, was finished, that it had nothing to do with a country that actually existed. These filmmakers wanted to go out into the streets, to film in real locations with natural light, to cast non-actors, to tell stories about ordinary people, about poverty and survival and the texture of daily life. They called it neo-realism, though the name came later, and it was less a set of rules than a shared instinct that the camera should look at what was actually there. The key figure in this movement was Roberto Rossellini, a director who had made a film called Rome Open City in 1945, shot during the final months of the occupation with very little money and a script that changed day by day depending on what was possible. The film was raw and immediate and emotionally overwhelming, and it made Rossellini's reputation. Fellini, who was still making a living writing jokes and drawing cartoons, heard about Rossellini and wanted to work with him. He went to see him, brought some of his drawings and sketches, talked his way into Rossellini's circle. Rossellini liked him, liked his energy and his humor, and the way he could come up with ideas quickly. He hired Fellini as a screenwriter. This was Fellini's real education in cinema. Working with Rossellini, he learned how films were made from the inside, how a script was not a fixed thing, but a starting point, how a scene could be built around a location or an actor's face or a quality of light, how the camera could discover things instead of just recording them. He worked on Rossellini's Paysan in 1946, a film told in 6 episodes about the Allied liberation of Italy, each one set in a different part of the country, each one about the gap between the liberators and the liberated, the confusion and violence and occasional grace that happened when strangers met in the ruins. Fellini co-wrote several of the episodes, inventing scenes and dialogue, riding around with Rossellini as they scouted locations, watching the director work with non-actors, pulling performances out of people who had never been in front of a camera. He worked on other films too, writing and rewriting scripts, sometimes credited, sometimes not. He worked on a film called The Miracle in 1948, which Rossellini directed, a short piece about a simple-minded peasant woman who believes she has been visited by Saint Joseph and is carrying the Christ child. It was strange and ambiguous and blasphemous depending on who was watching, and it got Rossellini in trouble with the church and with censors. Fellini learned from this too, learned that a film could be a scandal, that images could make people angry, that there was power in what you showed and how you showed it. But he was still writing other people's films, still working for hire. He wanted to direct, though he did not say it directly, did not announce it as an ambition. He was careful, watchful, accumulating technique and confidence. In 1950, he co-directed a film called Variety Lights with Alberto Latuada, a more established director who let Fellini share the credit. The film was about a third-rate traveling theater troupe, performers who moved from town to town doing cheap variety shows, singers and dancers and comics who dreamed of making it in Rome but never would. It was a story Fellini knew in his bones, the world of small-time entertainers, the tawdriness and the hope, and the way people kept performing even when no one was watching. He cast Giulietta in one of the roles, a small part as a loyal girlfriend, and he filled the film with the textures of backstage life, costumes hanging on racks, makeup smeared on in dressing rooms, the empty theater in the afternoon before the crowd arrived. The film was not a success, but it was a beginning. Fellini directed his first solo film in 1952, a project called The White Sheik, a comedy about a newlywed couple who come to Rome on their honeymoon. The wife is obsessed with a photo-romance serial, cheap illustrated stories sold in magazines, and she sneaks away to meet the actor who plays the White Sheik, her fantasy hero. The film was about the gap between the fantasy and the reality, the way the actor playing the Sheik was just a vain, shallow man in a costume, but also the way the fantasy mattered anyway, the way it shaped how people lived. It was not a hit either, but it had moments that were pure Fellini, the combination of tenderness and satire, the fascination with performers and illusions. His next film was I Vitelloni, made in 1953, and it was the one that made people notice him. The title means something like the young bulls or the big calves, a slang term for aimless young men, and the film was about exactly that. A group of friends in a small seaside town, not quite young anymore, but not yet grown up, drifting through days filled with cafes and pool halls and half-hearted flirtations, waiting for something to happen that would pull them into real life. It was set in a town very much like Rimini, and the characters were drawn from people Fellini had known, versions of himself and his friends, the ones who stayed and the ones who left. The film was warm and observant and sad in a quiet way. It did not moralize about the young men, it did not punish them or redeem them. It just watched them, followed them through a season of their lives, and let the audience feel the weight of time passing, the sense that these days would end, and nothing much would have changed. The film was a success in Italy and abroad, and Fellini was suddenly a director people talked about, a name that meant something. He followed it with La Strada in 1954, and this was the film that changed everything. It was a fable, a story about a young woman named Gelsomina, simple-minded and innocent, who is sold by her mother to a brutish traveling strongman named Zampano. He travels from town to town performing his act, breaking a chain with his chest, and she goes with him, learning to play the trumpet and assist him, living in a kind of servitude that is also, ambiguously, a marriage. They meet a tightrope walker called the Fool, a man who is Zampano's opposite, light and playful and cruel in his own way, and the three of them form a strange triangle that ends in tragedy. Fellini cast Giulietta as Gelsomina, and she gave a performance that was unlike anything else in Italian cinema at the time, childlike and luminous and heartbreaking. She moved through the film like a figure from a fairy tale, wide-eyed and stumbling, and the camera loved her. Anthony Quinn played Zampano, all bulk and silence and violence, and Richard Basehart played the Fool, angular and grinning and doomed. The film was shot mostly on location in small towns and along roadsides, and it had the rough textures of neorealism but also something else, a sense of myth, of archetypal forces moving under the surface. La Strada was enormously successful, winning prizes and finding audiences around the world, But it also made certain critics angry, especially in Italy, especially among the left-wing intellectuals who had championed no-realism. They saw the film as a betrayal of the movement's principles, too sentimental, too mystical, too concerned with universal suffering instead of the specific social conditions that caused it. They wanted films about workers and class struggle, and Fellini had made a film about a clown and a strongman and the mystery of grace. He did not defend himself very loudly, he just kept working. In 1957 he made Nights of Cabiria, another film built around Giulietta, this time playing a prostitute in Rome who keeps believing in love even as she is betrayed and humiliated again and again. The film followed Cabiria through a series of encounters, with clients, with a movie star who picks her up on a whim, with a man who seems to offer her a chance at a normal life, and then reveals himself to be a con artist after her savings. The film was picaresque and painful, and Giulietta played it with a combination of toughness and hope that made Cabiria both ridiculous and unbearably moving. At the end, after she has been robbed and abandoned, she walks down a road and encounters a group of young people singing and laughing, and she smiles at them through her tears, and the film ends on that smile, which is either the triumph of the human spirit or the ultimate delusion, depending on what you bring to it. The film won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, and Fellini's reputation was now international. He was seen as a humanist, a director interested in the souls of outcasts, in the poetry of failure. But he was already moving away from that version of himself, already thinking about something else. He was becoming famous, moving in circles that included actors and producers and celebrities, the Roman world of Via Veneto and the nightclubs and the paparazzi, who followed people around with cameras. He was watching that world, fascinated and repelled by it, and he was beginning to think about what it meant to live inside spectacle, to be always performing, always watched. In 1960, he made La Dolce Vita, and it was the film that made him not just a successful director, but a cultural figure, a name that meant something beyond cinema. The film was nearly 3 hours long, shot in black and white, and it followed a gossip journalist named Marcello, played by Marcello Mastroianni, through a week of nights in Rome. Marcello moved between parties and nightclubs and the homes of aristocrats and intellectuals, observing and participating in a life of endless pleasure and profound emptiness. The film had no conventional plot, just a series of episodes, each one a different facet of the so-called sweet life. Marcello with a movie star, Marcello with an heiress, Marcello at an outdoor miracle where the Madonna is supposedly appearing, Marcello at an orgy in a seaside villa. The opening scene became iconic immediately, a helicopter carrying a statue of Christ over the rooftops of Rome, workers waving from scaffolding, sunbathers calling up from a rooftop terrace. It was an image of the sacred reduced to spectacle, religion as public relations, and it set the tone for everything that followed. The film was full of images like that, moments that felt both real and symbolic. A woman wading into the Trevi fountain in a black dress, a grotesque fish pulled from the sea at dawn, a bored aristocrat wandering through her own party in dark glasses. The most famous scene was the Trevi fountain sequence, where Marcello follows Sylvia, an American movie star played by Anita Ekberg, through the streets at night. She is enormous and blonde and barely real, a fantasy made flesh, and she climbs into the fountain and calls to him to join her. The water pours down around them, and for a moment it feels like something is possible, some escape from the deadness of everything else, but then the water is turned off and the moment ends, and they are just two people standing in a dry fountain. The scene was about desire and disillusionment, about the way the image promises something it can never deliver, and it was shot with such beauty and longing that it became the image people associated with Rome, with a certain kind of glamorous decay. La Dolce Vita was a scandal and a sensation. The Vatican condemned it, conservative groups protested, People lined up to see it anyway, and it played for months in theaters around the world. The phrase La Dolce Vita entered the language as a shorthand for a certain kind of jaded hedonism, and the photographers who followed celebrities around became known as paparazzi, after a character in the film Paparazzo, Marcello's photographer friend. Fellini had made a film about the emptiness of spectacle, and the spectacle swallowed the film, turned it into exactly the kind of event it was critiquing. He saw the irony. He did not seem to mind. The success of La Dolce Vita made Fellini the most famous director in the world, or one of them, and it also paralyzed him. He had a contract to make another film. Producers were waiting, money had been spent, sets were being built, but he did not know what the film was about. He had ideas, images, scenes, but no story that held them together. He tried to write a script, or several scripts, something about a man in a failing marriage, something about memory and childhood, something about creative paralysis. He could not find the through line, the structure. He began to panic, to feel that he had run out of ideas, that the success had emptied him out, and then he realized that the paralysis was the film. The film would be about a director who cannot make a film, who is surrounded by producers and actors and journalists, all demanding to know what the film is about, and who has no answer. The film would be about creative crisis, about the inability to choose, about the way memory and fantasy and desire all flood in when you try to make something and you cannot tell which images are real and which are invented and which are worth anything. He began to work from that idea, building a script that was half confession and half fiction, about a man named Guido, a famous director, played by Marcello Mastroianni again, who is supposed to be making a science fiction film, but who cannot concentrate because he is haunted by memories of his childhood, his parents, his religious education, and by fantasies of the women in his life, his wife, his mistress, the women he has known, the women he has invented. The film was called Otto e Mezzo, 8.5, because it was Fellini's 8.5 film. He counted his co-direction of Variety Lights as a half. The number became part of the film's identity, a kind of joke, and also a statement of method, the idea that a film could be a fragment, an incomplete confession, and still be whole. 8.5 became the shorthand for a certain kind of self-reflexive film, the movie about the impossibility of making the movie. And it has been imitated and referenced, and echoed so many times that it is easy to forget how strange and risky it was when it first appeared in 1963. The film begins at a traffic jam. Guido is stuck in his car, unable to move, unable to breathe, and the camera is inside the car with him, showing his panic. The steam on the windows, the other drivers staring. He floats up and out of the car, drifting into the sky, free for a moment, until someone pulls him back down with a rope. It is a dream or a fantasy, and the film never entirely separates the dream from the waking life, never tells you clearly which scenes are happening and which are in Guido's head. Guido is at a spa, recovering from some vague illness, surrounded by his producer and his production team, all of whom are waiting for him to tell them what the film is about. He meets with his wife, played by Anouk Aimée, who is elegant and distant and tired of his infidelities. He meets with his mistress, played by Sandra Milo, who is voluptuous and needy, and who he cannot quite leave or quite commit to. He remembers his childhood, a scene on a beach where he and other boys paid to see a prostitute named Serene dance, and then the priests found out and punished him, made him kneel and confess, filled him with shame. He remembers his mother, his father, the rituals of the church, the way he was taught that desire was sin and that women were either saints or whores. And he can see now that he has never escaped that teaching, that his life is a series of repetitions of those early lessons. He imagines a harem, a fantasy where all the women in his life live together in a white farmhouse and take care of him, and he is the master and they are content, until they are not, until they rebel and he has to crack a whip to control them. The scene is absurd and troubling and comic all at once. an expression of a fantasy so deep and so childish that it reveals itself as pathetic even as it unfolds. Fellini was showing the inside of a certain kind of male imagination, the Italian Catholic male imagination, the one shaped by mothers and priests, and the impossible ideal of female purity, and he was showing it without excusing it, letting it be what it was. The film builds toward a press conference where Guido is supposed to explain his film to the journalists, but he has nothing to say, and the scene becomes a nightmare of evasion and exposure, everyone asking questions he cannot answer, and finally he crawls under the table and, in one version of the scene, shoots himself. But the film does not end there. It returns to the set, the enormous scaffold that has been built for the science fiction film that will never be made, and Guido decides to abandon the project, to admit failure. But then, in the final moments, he sees everyone he has known or imagined, all the characters from his life and his fantasies, walking in a circle, holding hands, and he joins them, and the film ends with this image of reconciliation, or maybe just acceptance, the idea that you can live with contradiction, that you do not have to choose, that the film and the failure to make the film can be the same thing. 8½ won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film and became the most influential film about the creative process ever made. It named a genre, the 8½-like film, the movie about making the movie, and directors from Woody Allen to Charlie Kaufman to Paul Thomas Anderson have made versions of it. Films where the artist is the subject and the crisis is the story. But none of them have the particular combination of lightness and depth that Fellini achieved. The way the film is both a confession and a performance, both deeply personal and completely artificial. Fellini had reached a point where his autobiography and his art were no longer separable, where the life was material for the films and the films shaped how the life was lived. He was famous now in a way that few directors had ever been, recognized on the street, interviewed constantly, asked to explain himself. He gave interviews freely and said things that were charming and evasive and contradictory. He insisted that his films were not autobiographical, even when they obviously were, or at least were drawn from his life. He said he made everything up, that memory was just another form of invention, that the truth was whatever served the film. He was constructing a persona, the Fellini who existed in public, the dreamer, the magician, the man who lived in his imagination. He kept working. In 1965, he made Juliet of the Spirits, his first film in color, built around Giulietta again, playing a middle-aged housewife who suspects her husband of infidelity, and who begins to have visions, fantasies that bleed into her daily life. The film was a riot of color, reds and oranges and purples, costumes and sets that looked like they belonged in a circus or a fever dream. Fellini used color the way he used everything else, not to represent reality but to heighten it, to turn the ordinary world into a spectacle. The film was uneven, overstuffed, but it had images that stayed with you. Giulietta, in a white dress, wandering through rooms filled with spirits and memories, the line between the real and the imagined dissolving completely. He made Fellini's Satyricon in 1969, an adaptation of Petronius that was less an adaptation than a hallucination, a vision of ancient Rome as an alien and decadent world, full of grotesque faces and bizarre rituals. The film looked like nothing else, shot in oversaturated colors, filled with non-actors and strange physical types, dwarfs and giants and people with skin conditions, bodies that did not fit the Hollywood ideal. It was Fellini's argument that the past was not knowable, not something you could reconstruct with tokas and columns, but something stranger and more disturbing, and the only honest way to film it was to admit that you were making it up. In 1970, he made The Clowns, a film that was part documentary, part fantasy, about his search for the old circus clowns of his childhood. He traveled to circuses and nursing homes, filming interviews with aging performers, trying to capture what the circus had meant before it became a tourist attraction, when it was still a living tradition. The film was nostalgic but also aware of the limits of nostalgia, the way the past cannot be recovered, only reimagined. He appeared in the film himself, or a version of himself, the director searching for something that may never have existed in the form he remembers. In 1972, he made Roma, a film that was not a story but a series of sketches and impressions of the city he had lived in for 30 years, the city that had shaped him more than any other place. The film moved between past and present, between Fellini's memories of arriving in Rome as a young man and the Rome of the early 1970s, loud and polluted and chaotic. There were scenes of a massive traffic jam, cars honking in the rain, a fashion show in which the costumes were made from flashing lights and transparent plastic, a sequence where workers digging a subway tunnel break through into an ancient Roman villa, and the frescoes on the walls begin to fade as soon as the air touches them, a perfect image of the past disappearing under the weight of the present. In 1973 he made Amarcord, which means "I remember" in the Rimonese dialect, and it was his most direct return to his childhood, a series of vignettes set in a small town during the fascist era. The film was warm and comic and strange, full of eccentric characters and rituals, a lawyer who climbs a tree and shouts, "I want a woman," a peacock that appears in the snow, a parade where an enormous papier-mâché head of Mussolini is carried through the streets. The film did not treat fascism as a nightmare, but as a farce, a ridiculous performance that everyone went along with, because it was easier than resisting, and the comedy made the critique sharper, made it clear that fascism succeeded not through terror alone, but through spectacle, through the agreement to participate in the lie. Amarcord won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, Fellini's fourth, and it was a popular success, the most accessible film he had made in years. But it was also the end of something. After Amarcord, the work became harder to finance, harder to justify to producers who wanted stories that made sense, and audiences who wanted clarity. Fellini kept making films, but they were stranger, more personal, more difficult. In 1976, he made Casanova, with Donald Sutherland in the title role, a film that took one of the great romantic figures of history and turned him into a grotesque, a mechanical man performing seduction like a series of gymnastics, empty and compulsive. The film was cold and deliberate, shot mostly in the studio on artificial sets, everything heightened and unreal, and it was Fellini's most explicit critique of the Don Juan fantasy, the idea that endless conquest could be a form of freedom. The film was not a success, and Fellini seemed hurt by the response, defensive in interviews, insisting that he had made the film he wanted to make. In 1979, he made Orchestra Rehearsal, a short film about an orchestra falling apart, the musicians rebelling against the conductor, chaos overtaking order, and it was clearly a political allegory, a response to the violence and instability of Italy in the 70s, the years of terrorism and strikes, and the sense that the center was not holding. The film was pessimistic in a way Fellini's films usually were not, ending not with reconciliation but with exhaustion, the musicians going back to playing because there is nothing else to do. In 1980, he made City of Women, a film that returned to the territory of 8.5, a man lost in a world of female fantasies and judgments, but this time the film felt heavier, more defensive, less playful. The main character, again played by Mastroianni, wanders through a hotel filled with feminists who put him on trial for his sexism, and the film tried to engage with feminist critiques of Fellini's work, but ended up mostly restating his own obsessions, the archetypes and fantasies that he could not escape, or did not want to escape. In 1983, he made And the Ship Sails On, a film set on a luxury ocean liner in 1914, carrying a group of opera singers to scatter the ashes of a famous soprano. The film was artificial in the extreme, shot entirely on sound stages, with painted backdrops, the ocean obviously fake, the whole thing announced as a performance, a constructed world. It was Fellini at his most Fellini-esque, which by this point had become a limitation as much as a signature, the sense that he was repeating himself, that the tricks and the flourishes were covering an absence. In 1986, he made Ginger and Fred with Giulietta and Mastroianni as a pair of aging dancers who used to perform as imitators of Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire, and who are reunited for a television variety show. The film was sad and funny and full of affection for the performers and contempt for the television industry, which Fellini saw as the degradation of everything he loved about entertainment, the reduction of spectacle to something cheap and cynical. The film had scenes of the television studio that were chaotic and grotesque, an endless parade of bizarre acts and vapid hosts, and the two dancers trying to perform their old routine were lost in the noise. In 1990, he made The Voice of the Moon, his final film, a loose adaptation of a novel by Ermanno Cavazzoni, about a man recently released from a mental hospital wandering through a surreal landscape of late-night television, political rallies, and strange rituals. The film was quiet and elegiac, less frantic than his earlier work, more reflective, and it felt like Fellini saying goodbye, walking through the ruins of the Italy he had known, finding beauty in the fragments. He was in his 70s now, his health declining. He had heart problems, he was tired, but he kept working on projects, treatments, and scripts that would not get made. In 1993, he received an honorary Academy Award for Lifetime Achievement, presented to him in a ceremony in Rome, because he was too ill to travel to Los Angeles. He gave a short speech, thanking Giulietta, thanking the movies, speaking in Italian with subtitles, and he seemed frail, but still present, still the performer. He died on October 31, 1993, the day after his 50th wedding anniversary with Giulietta. She died a few months later, in March of 1994, and they were buried together in Rimini, the town he had left and kept returning to in his films, the town that was the origin of everything. Fellini's legacy is vast and strange. He influenced generations of filmmakers, not by teaching them a method but by showing them the film could be a form of dreaming, that the camera could follow the logic of the imagination instead of the logic of narrative. Scorsese has spoken about him as a liberating force, the director who showed that you could make a film out of pure sensation, out of color and movement and faces. Almodovar has cited him as the example of a filmmaker who turned his obsessions into a world, who made the personal universal, not by generalizing, but by going deeper into the particular. Woody Allen has remade 8.5 multiple times, in Stardust Memories and Deconstructing Harry and Elsewhere, trying to capture the same mix of neurosis and charm, though always with more guilt and less grace. The word Fellini-esque entered the language, and it means something precise, a certain kind of grotesque beauty, the parade of exaggerated faces and bodies, the circus and the variety show as the structure underneath all human behavior, the mixture of the sacred and the profane, the high and the low. It means spectacle that knows it is spectacle, that revels in its own artificiality. It means a world where everything is slightly more than real, where the camera tilts and swirls and shows you things that are impossible and yet feel true. But there is also a critique embedded in the legacy, a sense that Fellini's films are too much, too indulgent, too in love with their own excess. Feminist critics have pointed out rightly that his films are full of women who are not characters but projections, fantasy figures drawn from a very conventional male imagination, the mother, the whore, the muse, the devourer. He was aware of this, or claimed to be, said in interviews that he was showing the fantasy, not endorsing it, but the films themselves are ambiguous on this point, the camera lingering on bodies in a way that feels less like critique than like participation. His defense was always that he was not making documentaries, that he was not interested in realism or political correctness, that he was making dreams, and dreams are not fair or balanced. They are expressions of desire and fear, and to censor them is to lose what makes them dreams. There is also the question of whether the later films are successful or just repetitions, whether the style became a formula, whether the magic wore off. Some critics argue that after Amarcord, Fellini was making the same film over and over, that the surprises were gone, that the work became more about being Fellini-esque than about discovering something new. Others argue that the later films are underrated, that they are deeper and sadder than the earlier work, that they show an artist grappling with aging and obsolescence and the sense that the world has moved on. What is undeniable is that Fellini changed how people thought about film, what it could be, what it could do. Before him, even the greatest directors were bound by certain conventions. The story had to make sense, the images had to serve the narrative, the film had to be about something you could explain. Fellini showed that a film could be about the impossibility of explanation, that it could follow the rhythms of memory and fantasy, that it could be beautiful and confusing and moving all at once. He gave permission to filmmakers to trust their instincts, to follow images even when they did not know where they led, to make films that were acts of confession and invention at the same time. He also showed that a director could be a public figure, could construct a persona that was part of the work, could be both the artist and the subject. The Fellini who appeared in interviews, who told stories about his childhood and his dreams and his struggles with producers, was as much a creation as any character in his films, a performance of the artist as dreamer, as innocent as charlatan. He understood that in the age of celebrity, the artist's life becomes part of the spectacle, that the person and the work blur together, and he played with that blurring, made it part of his method. His films remain strange and alive, not museum pieces but works that still feel risky, still feel like they might go off the rails at any moment. To watch 8.5 Now, more than 60 years after it was made, is to feel the same vertigo that audiences felt in 1963, the sense that the film is dissolving as you watch it, that it is held together by nothing more than Fellini's nerve, his willingness to keep going even when he does not know where he is going. The film is about that willingness, about the courage or the madness required to make something when you are not sure what you are making, and it is still the most accurate portrait of the creative process ever put on screen, the way it feels from the inside, the panic and the exhilaration and the fear that you have nothing to say, and the discovery that you can say it anyway. The images from his films have become part of the visual language of cinema. The fountain, the circus, the parade of grotesques, the white dress in the dark, the empty set at dawn. They appear in other films, in advertisements, in music videos, often without credit because they have passed into the common stock of images, the vocabulary that filmmakers draw on without necessarily knowing where it came from. This is both a triumph and a loss, the way success turns a personal vision into a public resource, the way the images become separated from the sensibility that created them. Fellini himself seemed to understand this, seemed to know that his work would outlive him, and would be misunderstood and reused and celebrated for reasons he might not recognize. He kept working anyway, kept making films until he could not anymore, kept chasing images even when the money was harder to find and the audiences were smaller and the critics were less kind. He did not become bitter, or if he did, he hid it well, kept performing the role of the generous artist, the man who loved the movies and loved the people who made them and who believed, or said he believed, that the act of making was its own reward. There is a late interview, filmed a few years before he died, where he talks about the circus again, the circus of his childhood, and he says that what he loved about it was the sense of transformation, the way the tent went up and became a world, and then the next day the tent came down and the field was empty, and you could not tell that anything had happened. He says that films are like that you build a world and you believe in it completely while you are making it, and then it is over, and all that is left is the film, the images on the screen, and you move on to the next one. He says it with a kind of lightness, as if it is obvious, as if this is the only way to live. And maybe that is the final lesson of Fellini's work, the thing that remains when the images have been absorbed and the influence has been traced and the debates about his politics and his portrayals have been exhausted. He showed that you could make a life out of transformation, out of the daily act of turning the ordinary into the extraordinary, the real into the dreamed, the self into the spectacle. He showed that you did not have to resolve the contradictions, that you could hold them all at once, the sacred and the profane, the autobiographical and the invented, the confession and the lie. He made films that were about his life and also not about his life, films that were sincere and also performances of sincerity, and he did it with such energy and such joy that the question of whether it was true became irrelevant, or at least secondary. He was a dreamer, which is a way of saying he was a liar, which is a way of saying he was an artist, which is a way of saying he found a method of living that let him turn everything into material, into images, into the endless parade of faces and bodies and lights that filled his films and his imagination. He made the interior life exterior, made the fantasy visible, made the circus into cinema, and the cinema into a circus. And he did it so completely that the two became inseparable, became one thing, became Fellini. In the end, he made 13 feature films, give or take, depending on how you count, and a handful of shorts and documentaries and fragments. It is not a vast output compared to some directors, but each film is so dense, so packed with images and ideas and obsessions that they feel like more, feel like an entire world. To enter that world is to enter a place where the rules are different, where the camera might suddenly tilt up to the sky, or swoop down to follow a dog, where a scene that seems to be about one thing turns out to be about something else, or about nothing at all, except the pleasure of watching, where beauty and ugliness exist side by side and are often the same thing. His films are not for everyone, and he would have been the first to admit it, would have said with a shrug that some people like circuses and some people do not, and if you do not like circuses, then his films are probably not for you. But for those who do like them, who are willing to enter the tent and let the show unfold at its own pace, who do not need everything explained or resolved, who can tolerate ambiguity and excess and the sense that the filmmaker is making it up as he goes along, the films are endlessly rewarding, endlessly surprising, endlessly alive. They are films to get lost in, films that do not offer easy answers or clear messages, but that offer something rarer, a vision of life as it feels rather than as it is supposed to be, full of contradictions and longings and memories that may or may not be true, full of faces that are beautiful and grotesque, full of moments that are sacred and ridiculous, full of the sense that anything could happen next and probably will. They are films made by someone who loved the movies, not because they were realistic, but because they were not, because they could show you things that did not exist and make you believe in them anyway, because they were a form of magic, a way of transforming light into dreams. Fellini made that magic for more than 40 years, and the magic still works, still casts its spell, still pulls you into the tent, and shows you things you have never seen, and makes you glad you came. He was the supreme auteur of the Italian cinema, but more than that, he was the supreme auteur of his own imagination, the man who turned his obsessions and his memories and his fantasies into a body of work that looks like nothing else, that could only have been made by him, that is as strange and as generous and as excessive as the man himself, which is to say, very strange, very generous, very excessive, and entirely his own.